Welcome back, movie fans. Today I'm going to be telling you about the top 10 things you missed in Asteroid City. Number 11. Asteroid City is the 11th film from King of Twee, Wes Anderson, which follows Augie Steenbeck and his children as they get stuck in a desert town. Shenanigans ensue, basically. There's not much more to it. People have been extremely mixed on Asteroid City. It is a broad spectrum from love it to hate it. Not even just people who don't usually go for Wes Anderson's style. A lot of Wes Anderson fans are like, this is his worst fucking movie. It's dull, it's boring, he's playing the hits. I thought I was having a religious experience in the Asteroid City Theater. This film knocked me over like a fucking hurricane, and I'm still recovering. I am blowing away as we speak. I have been constantly tweeting about this film, and I've written multiple letterboxd reviews. I've even fucking gone up to people in real life, been like, hey, have you seen Asteroid City yet? And I realize that I still have a lot more to say about this movie, because it presents a lot of themes, and there is a lot that emotionally resonated with me, and I'm sure emotionally resonated with others, and I figured, why not talk about it? I want to real quick make a disclaimer here that it is perfectly fine to not like a movie. It is okay. I understand that this isn't going to like change minds. It's more for myself and more for people who are on the fence about seeing this movie. If you fucking hated Asteroid City, you don't need to comment and be all like, well, this sucked and this sucked and this sucked. It's good for engagement though. Like and subscribe. I'm also not an authority on this film. When it comes to things that have a lot of emotional resonance, there's going to be a broad spectrum of interpretations, and an Asteroid City is really fucking packed with a lot of different symbolism, and I'm still constantly learning things about this movie that make me fucking rethink this entire video, and I'm like, I'm not an authority on this. So take everything I say with a grain of salt, and with that, let us begin. So this film has a few layers, kind of like an ogre, and I'm going to work from the outer shell of Asteroid City, just like the base of what it is, going more towards the center. As I mentioned before, it's this family who recently, Augie, the main character, recently lost his wife, and they get stuck in this desert community, Asteroid City, while trying to process that grief and loss. The entire structure of this movie is you get the introduction of the characters and their situations. An alien shows up directly in the middle, and then you get to see these characters' reaction to the alien. It's a straightforward collection of character moments, and it just so happens that a lot of these character moments are really good, especially because Asteroid City confronts questions about like grief, finding meaning in life, kind of existentialism, love and connection, and you get to understand how these characters relate to that concept. I don't know if I've mentioned it or if it's very obvious by the fact that this character is a man in the mid-1950s, but Augie Steenbeck is emotionally walled off as shit. We find out really early in the film that his wife has been dead for 3 weeks, and he has not had the nerve to tell his kids yet, which is insane. He does a really good job once he does tell them. One of my favorite like moments in the whole film is Augie mentions that like, because he has these little girls as well as his teenage son, and he mentions like, but your guys' concept of time is completely distorted. One girl is like,
15 minutes is 6,200 hours.
But he says very nicely like, yeah, exactly, and that's not your fault. I love that scene. And beyond that, that scene is very much like a rehearsed speech almost that Augie is giving to his children, but then beyond that, he is not very emotionally articulate, whether because he's in the grieving process or if this was his way of processing emotions prior. One relationship that is a main pillar of this story is Augie's relationship with Midge, who is a like famous movie star actress in the universe. They kind of meet by chance, and then it's very interesting how actually unnatural a lot of the relationship development between Augie and Midge feels, but in a way that makes it seem more real, if that makes any sense at all. They talk for a little bit, and then Midge comes on to Augie extremely hard. They just continue talking after that. There's not a lot of like, hey, how's your Tuesday? These two are very to the point and direct. They form this relationship. Midge even goes so far as to say it explicitly based on shared pain, as they are both people who are very emotionally walled off, though for different reasons. And one other part between this connection that I find really interesting is that Augie and Midge like show each other their art a lot of the time. As I said, Midge is an actress. Then Augie is a war photographer. Like the bulk time that we spend with Augie and Midge is Midge rehearsing lines. The conversations always start with Augie showing Midge a new photograph, and I think it's really really interesting how art is a pillar of their connection, but yet they don't necessarily engage with each other's art. Or rather, Midge doesn't actually engage with Augie's art, because Augie very much engages with Midge rehearsing lines by way of being her audience, and then eventually going so far as to help her rehearse. And I just find it so interesting that sharing art is presented as a major form of connection in this film. Asteroid City presents a lot of different ways of processing grief and connecting to people. But it's interesting when you look at Augie dealing with grief and then to parallel that with his son Woodrow. The film makes visual parallels between the two very early on, because, father and son. You see Woodrow being a lot more emotionally articulate about grief, which I thought was really interesting. He eventually makes friends with these other teenagers in like this science camp group, and he's able to open up about the loss in small ways. He mentions it pretty openly on the same day of learning of his mother's death. And as he grows closer with Dinah, who is Midge's daughter, Woodrow and Dinah are able to be a lot more emotionally open with each other, mutually as well. Dinah expresses a lot of feelings about her relationship with her mother and her place in the world in general, how she feels kind of out of place.
Sometimes I think I feel more at home outside the Earth's atmosphere.
And Woodrow is able to discuss his feelings about the recent loss. And it's great, and I like Woodrow and Dinah. However, if there is one thing I would change about this movie, there's one thing. Don't make Dinah Midge's daughter. Don't. It's shitty because I understand why it was this way, right? Because we're paralleling Augie and Woodrow through these relationships. But I just don't like the little romantic parallel lines we've got going on here. One character who I think gets overlooked a lot when examining this film's presentations of grief is Augie's father-in-law, Stanley, Tom Hanks' grandpa. Augie and Stan have an evidently strained relationship. We don't fully get the details on why, but we see a lot of their opposing viewpoints throughout the film. And that includes their approaches to grief, right? Stanley's act is very much presented as a helping figure. He's a character who seems to give a lot of support and not necessarily always expect to receive that kind of support in return. And he says it himself directly in the film. He gives unquestioning faith to the people he loves. And there's this brilliant conversation near the middle of the film that highlights Augie and Stan's opposing viewpoints when it comes to grief, because they're just talking about how they're gonna make this work, with Augie and his family staying with Stan. And Augie is questioning if they're welcome there, right? Because Stan very much doesn't like Augie. But Stan makes it very clear to Augie and his family that, he wants to help them, and it makes him feel good to help them out through this grieving period, It's quite beautiful watching Stan be open and honest about his process with grief, even though he and Augie have a lot of tension in their dynamic, right? And Augie is very much refusing this help initially.
Stop helping us. We're in grief.
Me too.
It's almost difficult watching Stan open up to his son-in-law about this struggle with grief and seeing Augie not be very receptive to it. But at the same time, I understand part of the grieving process is that it can be a very isolating experience, right? And for a character like Augie, who seems to very much be a very independent person anyway, especially when it comes to emotions, Augie isn't very community oriented, whereas Stan is community oriented. And Augie is just in a place with the grief where he cannot accept that help coming in, right? He cannot value the emotional energy that his father-in-law is giving to him. And I think it's really powerful how this film really transparently shows that, because it can be a very ugly part of grieving and of general mental health struggle is the unwillingness to accept help and that feeling of isolation. And I understand all this, but I also kind of want Augie to stop being a little bitch here. Like, he's trying to help you, and he's also going through the same struggle. Please just say fucking thank you. Overall, this film has a lot of multifaceted and complicated representations of grief in a way that I think is really beautiful. And it's also interesting to see how Augie and Woodrow and Stan, how their generation impacts how they deal with grief, right? Their age and the time they grew up in. And I just think this movie is definitely worth watching because of that presentation of such a pretty universal human emotion. Everyone has been through the grieving process before. We'll go through it eventually, or they're gonna go through it again. And I think it's important to have films like this that show different styles of grieving and show that it's all okay. Now let's get to the fun stuff. As I mentioned, an alien shows up. Funniest little freak in the world. Just gotta put that out there. I love him. I treasure him. A lot of people who are smarter than me have tried to connect the alien to different symbolism in the film. A lot of analyses see the alien as like death itself, because it is all black, right? And it's this sudden, random disruption of events. And I definitely see the merit in that. I definitely see the merit in trying to connect the alien to something larger. However, the way that I watch this film, I think it matters a lot less what the alien means, and rather the effects that this event has on the town, right? Because the visitation of the alien, it's complete absurdity, and that these characters have to make sense of, that completely destroys some of their understandings of the world. And Woodrow especially, after the alien, because he's like a little scientist man, seeing an alien come down and knowing, like, learning that there's so much more he doesn't know, it fucks with his head. He has this crisis of faith that's really interesting, as do a lot of the other scientist kids, and they all band together to kind of expose the truth of the alien to the rest of the country. We learn the most about how Woodrow is handling this, because alien, in tandem with just learning about his mother's death, it sends him to question a lot of meaning of life, if there is one, his place in the world. There's this really interesting scene that I think gets overlooked a lot of the time, where the scientist kids are all trying to find a way to contact the alien, and Woodrow kind of corrals them. He's like, this is our chance to do something that means something in our lifetime. And then the older scientist woman character pulls him aside and tells him that it is all worthwhile in his lifetime, and that it's very important for him to stay curious about the world and to continue exploring. Like, that scene mostly speaks for itself, I think, with how true it rings. In America, at least, we place a lot of value on children using their curiosity towards something greater. Right? We're always looking forward, and we see science as a path to development. There's always something more to be contributing to. That's capitalism, baby. But this film posits that, like, no, moving forward towards something with science is good, obviously. It's good to make that kind of progress, and it's good to push forward, but that isn't the only merit to science, and that isn't the only value to exploring and learning about the world. Alien causes this kind of crisis of faith in a lot of the children. There are these side characters. There's like a classroom with these young children, like first graders. They just want to learn more, right? They're excited. The adult characters are mostly unfazed by the alien. We mostly just see them upset that they have to stay in one place with no contact with the outside world.
Okay, everyone, please. It's been a typical quarantine.
And there's this really great scene that kind of highlights that difference in perspective when Augie and Stan, They're just talking about their plans going forward once they leave Asteroid City. And Woodrow's getting worked up. He's like shouting. He's like, "Don't you guys understand? The world's never going to be the same again." Woodrow confronts his dad. He's like, "You took a picture of him," kind of searching for some meaning in any of this, looking towards his father to find some meaning in any of this. And Augie is just like, very matter-of-factly, like, "I'm a photographer." I think the alien showing up in this story ultimately elevates this from just a story about death and coping with death to a story about coping with meaning as a whole, which is that's a lot of what coping with death is, right? I think having the alien be this like tangible, this further confrontation, I guess the lack of sense in the universe, it's perfect. It's brilliant. I love this movie. So this film actually uses a couple framing devices, which is like pretty standard in Wes Anderson films at this point. The movie we are watching is actually a television broadcast docuseries about a theatrical production of a play, and that play is Asteroid City. It's pretty clear that the only thing tethered to like a reality, the only thing that is considered real in the movie is the television broadcast, and that even the documentary, that it's not a documentary, right? Even the television special is using a fake play with fake characters. But when you get like 4 layers deep, I can't get 4 layers deep. I choose to believe that the TV special is a documentary, otherwise my brain will explode. And having Asteroid City be structured as a play gives a lot of really interesting context to what is otherwise a very straightforward story. And the themes end up tying together in a lot of really, really interesting ways with the context of these actors and writers. We get to know a few of them. We get a scene with Midge's actress and who was going to be the understudy for Woodrow, who then becomes the main Woodrow in the performance we're seeing. We learn about the play's director, Schubert Green. The main thing I care about with Schubert Green is that he gave the best YouTuber apology of all time.
Dear Kim, I'm sorry I shouted and called you a spoiled bitch and a minor talent and broke your glasses and threw them out the window.
But really the two people involved in the production who we get the most information on through this play structure is Conrad Earp, the playwright, and Jones Hall, who is the main actor for Augie Steenbeck. 20 minutes into the movie, we get our first major scene within the framing device in the black and white with the different aspect ratio, where we meet Jones Hall and Conrad Earp. So when we first meet Jones Hall, he rolls up to Conrad Earp's house a little bit uninvited. Conrad was like, "No, go away," but then he makes himself welcome. He stares at the homoerotic cowboy paintings on Conrad Earp's wall for a moment, gives him ice cream, does a monologue. They have gay sex.
That window sticks a bit. That window sticks a bit.
So when I first saw this movie, I initially just saw the kiss as like a throwaway. Wes Anderson has this pattern in his movies where he like offhand mentions queerness, and it's usually not like played for a joke, but not in a way that's like negative, but mostly just a throwaway, haha.
Entitlement is You're not getting boy with apple, you goddamn little fruit.
And I thought that's what this was. I thought this was just like, haha, gay people, theater in the 50s, it happened. But no, like this relationship between Jones and Conrad is kind of a center of the experience of Asteroid City, in my opinion. As we see further, the next scene that we get with Jones Hall, what happens first is that Jones ends up like speaking through Augie on stage for a moment, and he asks this question that was previously posed, but it wasn't seen as a big deal, but he asks the question again.
Why does Augie burn his hand on the quickie griddle?
I still don't understand the play.
And he runs off stage basically during the performance we're seeing. I feel like there's this really palpable shift between his introductory scene and him running off stage. Because in his introduction, he seemed like a jovial little fella, eating ice cream and breaking windows and whatnot. In this scene where he's confronting Schubert Green, he just seems a lot more morose. Just like a completely different headspace. He confronts Schubert Green with a lot of questions about the play his performance, he confides in Schubert Green that playing this character, he feels lost, and he doesn't know if he can keep doing it. And he doesn't understand what he's doing in the performance. He doesn't understand the play.
Doesn't matter. Just keep telling the story.
This exchange broke me hard to my core, because when you're a creative, you're always putting a lot of yourself into your work, even if it's not necessarily autobiographical. You're using art to understand experiences and other people. It's your perception of the world in your art. I feel like a lot of the times with character writing, the emotional lines can get blurred a little, which is good for the art, but bad for the soul. I've seriously had this happen to me a lot of times in my experience of writing and drawing characters, where even if I'm trying to make them different, I'm trying to make them separate from me, I still use them as a vehicle for my experiences, and I like destroy my mental health while I'm trying to do these characters justice. It can be so emotionally draining to be a creative and to want to create something that connects with people, to put that struggle and to put yourself in your character. Already, I really commend this movie for trying to confront those questions by trying to recognize that this is something that creatives, and I mean especially performers, I've never been an actor. I really can't imagine. And initially I read this as like, I took him at his word, basically, that this was insecurity in his performance and feeling lost in the structure of the play and in his performance, because it was mentioned in a throwaway line that Jones Hall was found in a very small part. He seemingly just doesn't like act on the regular, and a lot of his feelings of feeling lost, of not knowing what to do, seemed to relate, I thought, to like a lot of insecurity in his ability and his performance, which is that's also a very relatable art thing, insecurity in your ability. Then Jones runs outside, and he runs into an actress who is going to play a role in Asteroid City, but her part got cut. And here I want to mention something very innovative that the framing device does, with it being a play, is that throughout these black and white segments, you get to see fragments of the Asteroid City story, right? Like the cutting room floor is a part of this story. We get all these different cut lines and ideas that are toyed around with, and a lot of it culminates in this scene with Margot Robbie's character. Like, she literally admits that they cut her scene from the play for running time. I love getting to see that, like, Asteroid City as a play, it has all these great emotional themes, but like the plot of it's like this weird little shitty sci-fi drama story, and that they played around with all these like really corny ideas, like Woodrow's sisters being aliens. And we don't get to see the climax of the play, but rather we get to see the emotional climax in Jones Hall's conversation with Margot Robbie's character, in which she just recites her cut lines, her cut part, right after we learn about the death of the playwright Conrad Earp. And that recontextualizes a lot about the black and white segments, because where I was reading Jones Hall running off stage as like an insecurity and ability, and him feeling lost with the character as part of the artistic experience, we now, through that moment, can then be recontextualized through Conrad Earp's death, because it is extremely likely that the playwright Conrad Earp, who was Jones Hall's lover, is dead during the performance of Asteroid City we're seeing. And all of that, those feelings of loss and not understanding why you're continuing with a performance, it's Jones Hall grieving too. Using the framing device to this effect, to have these layers, to have these characters of Jones Hall and Augie Steenbeck blend into each other in this way, it is a shocking use of a Wes Anderson framing device, to put it bluntly. I haven't seen many other of his films, but in Grand Budapest and French Dispatch, it just felt like the story within a story was mostly there for flair, but having Asteroid City as a play, the themes tie together. And this becomes not just a story about coping with grief and meaning and death, but it is a story about characters coping with this struggle through performance, through making art. Breathtaking. This then transitions us into probably one of the most talked about scenes in the film and the emotional climax, where we are in the acting class that a lot of the Asteroid City play actors were selected from. Everyone starts chanting, "You can't wake up if you don't fall asleep." I've seen this movie 4 times at this point, and I am still dumbfounded by that line. There are a lot of people smarter than me that have picked this apart, that have related it to death. A lot of people understand this as a culmination of Wes Anderson's filmmaking philosophy, right? Because the whole thing with his films, everyone's like, they're so pretentious and I don't get it. Wes Anderson is positing that you have to be willing to engage with the film. You have to meet it halfway there and let it take you somewhere rather than coming in and trying to expect an emotional response. You can't get an emotional response without willing to engage with the film first. And I think both of those interpretations are great. I just feel like there's a couple lost details when talking about this scene. We have a scene in this classroom earlier in the film where sleep is brought up, and the professor explicitly says that sleep is not death, right? And I know it's very tempting to just want to connect every metaphor in this film to death, basically. But we have to consider what the professor said. Sleep is not death when we're trying to find an interpretation for this line, right? At least I think. I think it was a very deliberate choice to have the professor say that. But then, to almost contradict everything I just said, this line occurs directly after we learn of the death of Conrad Earp, right? It's like immediate. I'm not sure how that ties into the overall symbolism, but I feel like it's certainly worth something. That it does almost feel like "you can't wake up if you don't fall asleep" is in direct response to the death of Conrad Earp, right? One last detail, I'm not sure if this necessarily enhances the understanding of the metaphor, or if it's necessarily worth including in the analysis. Jones Hall starts the chant, and that just makes me sad. Overall, I think having Asteroid City be structured as a story within a story is fundamental in elevating this film from like silly, quirky Wes Anderson time with aliens to this is a story about a lot.
I love the artifice of films. My whole fascination with animation is in the artifice, the process, learning how to move a character in just the right way with just the right amount of frames to create a performance. I buy art books and I watch behind-the-scenes features on DVD. I'm in love with artifice. Wes Anderson films are unique in that they are always very upfront about the artifice. They don't try to hide the fact that they are movies. And that is part of the charm and part of the style. Asteroid City is a story about artifice, about what it takes to create a production. And to see behind-the-scenes photos for this film, to see the artifice beyond the artifice, makes me deeply uncomfortable. The stories begin to collapse into each other even more, to a point that I lack the comprehension to describe. Knowing about the film's 4th, technically 5th layer, it's too close. It almost ruins some part of the experience. Please step back a bit. And yet this somewhat uncomfortable feeling is one that Asteroid City wants us to confront. Asteroid City wants us to understand artifice and to sit in artificiality for a moment. One of my favorite scenes in the film is when Augie is helping Midge rehearse her lines. And so we have Jason Schwartzman playing Jones Hall, playing Augie Steenbeck, trying to play another character. When Midge compels Augie to use his grief in his performance, that is where these layers start to converge, where every character and person and idea, when it all merges together, and we have to recognize that fact. This moment, I feel, highlights what Asteroid City is getting at, and ultimately what it wants us to feel. I think that moment is the ultimate meaning in the film, is to sit with the artifice of the art that we make and the art that we consume, and to recognize how blurry those boundaries can be.
So ultimately, what does this all amount to, right? We have these really big ideas being presented and these questions about grief and meaning, differing perspectives on it, like the generational divide in grief, and we have death through the context, the story itself, and through the actors portraying that story, and we get a lot of information about the process of creating a story. I promised you all an explanation. What does it mean? I don't fucking know.
Help on the rock! Help on the rock! Help on the rock!